Hey everyone, tonight we begin with 5 wars that nearly brought down the greatest dynasty Westeros had ever known. The Blackfyre rebellions, a century of civil war where brother fought brother, where dragons fell from the sky, and where the very meaning of legitimacy was written in blood and fire. This is the story of bastards who dared to claim thrones, of kings who watched their kingdoms burn, of a realm that tore itself apart over a single question: who has the right to rule? From the moment Aegon IV drew his dying breath and legitimized his bastards, to the final clash of steel at the Stepstones, where the last Blackfyre pretender fell, these 5 rebellions would reshape the 7 kingdoms forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let me share something that will haunt you through this entire story. In a torchlit chamber deep within the Red Keep, a dying king makes a decision that will cost the realm 100,000 lives. Aegon IV, called the Unworthy, lies on his deathbed, and with his final royal decree, he legitimizes every bastard he ever fathered, every single one. His queen weeps, his heir Daemon stands silent, knowing what this means. But across the kingdom, a bastard named Daemon Blackfyre places his hand on a sword. Not just any sword, the ancestral blade of Aegon the Conqueror himself. Blackfyre, Dark Sister's twin, a weapon that has never known defeat. The blade seems to sing in his grip, and in that moment, Daemon Blackfyre realizes something that will echo through history. If his father could make him legitimate with words, perhaps he could make himself king with steel. The year is 196. After conquest, the Targaryen dynasty has ruled for nearly 2 centuries. They have survived the Dance of Dragons, tamed the 7 kingdoms, and built an empire, but they have never faced anything like what's coming. Because when you give a bastard a crown's legitimacy and a conqueror's sword, you don't create a subject, you create a rival. What follows is not just rebellion, it's a war of dragons against dragons, of fire against fire, of one brother's love for a woman destroying an empire, and another brother's ambition nearly rebuilding it. 5 separate wars spanning a century, each one threatening to topple the Iron Throne, each one leaving the realm weaker, bloodier, more divided. But here's what the histories won't tell you. Here's the secret buried in the deepest vaults of Old Town, whispered only by the oldest maesters. These weren't 5 separate rebellions at all. They were 5 battles in one long war, a war that began not with swords, but with a king's weakness, not with ambition, but with love, not with bastards seeking crowns, but with a realm forgetting what legitimacy truly means. Tonight we'll walk through the ruins of castles burned in these wars. We'll stand in the throne room where Aegon the Unworthy made his fatal choice. We'll follow Daemon Blackfyre from beloved bastard to pretender king to corpse on a battlefield. We'll sail with Bittersteel as he forms the Golden Company in exile. We'll watch as rebellion becomes tradition, as each generation pays in blood for the sins of the last. You'll meet the players in this deadly game. Bloodraven, the bastard who stayed loyal, whose 1,000 eyes and one watched every shadow in the realm. Shiera Seastar, whose beauty sparked a love triangle that helped tear the kingdom apart. Bazello Breakspear, the prince who died stopping his own uncle's rebellion. Massey-Car, who killed his brother to save his father's crown. But most of all, you'll discover why these rebellions mattered, why 5 wars fought over legitimacy would weaken the Targaryen dynasty so badly that when Robert Baratheon's Warhammer finally fell, the Dragon dynasty had no strength left to resist. This is a story about the price of passion over duty, about what happens when kings choose their hearts over their realms, about how the ghosts of civil war echo through generations. It's about the Golden Company, still fighting Blackfyre wars 3 centuries later. It's about how bastards can inherit more than just names. Sometimes they inherit kingdoms. So settle in, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours unraveling one of the most complex, brutal, and tragic sagas in all of Westerosi history. A saga that begins with a dying king's last mistake and ends with a realm forever changed. The Blackfyre Rebellions. 5 wars, 1 throne. A dynasty that survived dragons couldn't survive the ambitions of its own blood. You are a historian of the realm, a seeker of truth, in an age where truth has been buried beneath layers of propaganda and royal decree. Your quest begins in the great library of the Citadel, where forbidden chronicles gather dust, and in the deep vaults beneath Dragonstone, where Targaryen secrets sleep in darkness. You are here to uncover what really happened during the century that nearly destroyed the Iron Throne. The year is 172 after conquest, and we must first understand the world before it burned. King's Landing has never been more prosperous. The Red Keep rises above the city like a crimson crown, its towers catching the morning sun as merchants fill the streets below. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the salt air from Blackwater Bay, and the sound of hammers rings from the Street of Steel, where master smiths forge weapons for a realm at peace. This is the reign of Aegon IV, though history will know him by a different name. For now he is simply the king, sitting the Iron Throne in all his majesty, beloved by his people for the prosperity his reign has brought. The crown sits easily on his head, and the throne that cut so many of his ancestors seems to welcome his presence. But if you know where to look, if you have the eyes of a historian trained to see beneath the surface, you can already spot the cracks in this golden facade. In the Tower of the Hand, you'll find correspondence that speaks of troubled relations with Dorne. Prince Daemon, the heir, advocates for peace through marriage alliance. His father prefers the promise of conquest through fire and blood. The first seeds of division are already planted between father and son, between the old way and the new. Walk through the royal apartments, and you'll encounter the women who will shape this story. Nerys, the queen, pale and pious, who spends her days in prayer and her nights weeping for the realm. Her husband's appetites are slowly poisoning. She loves her son Daemon with fierce devotion, knowing he represents everything good her husband is not. But she also knows the whispers about Daemon's true parentage, whispers that her husband encourages with every cruel smile. Then there are the others, the women who catch the king's eye and bear his bastards. Barbara Bracken, proud daughter of a proud house, who gives him Eiger rivers and believes her beauty makes her a queen in all but name. Melissa Blackwood, dark and lovely, whose son Brynden will grow up to be called Bloodraven. Serene of Lys, ethereal and mysterious, mother to Sheer a sea star, whose beauty will one day help drive the realm to war. Your companions in this investigation are the forgotten voices of history. Master Yarndell, whose chronicles hint at truths the crown preferred buried. The descendants of minor lords who chose sides in the coming wars and paid the price. Survivors of battles whose names have been struck from official records. Old women in the Riverlands who still remember the songs their grandmothers sang about the Black Dragon. Sellswords in exile who carry the bitter memories of defeats in foreign lands. But most importantly, you have the bastards themselves as your guides through this labyrinth of legitimacy and ambition. Daemon Waters, soon to be Daemon Blackfyre, stands tall in the practice yards of the Red Keep. At 17, he is already accounted the finest knight of his generation. His swordwork is poetry in motion. His presence commands attention. And when he smiles, even his father's court ladies whisper that he looks more kingly than the king himself. The Valyrian features are strong in him, purple eyes and silver gold hair marking him clearly as dragonborn, bastard though he may be. Watch him carefully as he trains, for you are witnessing the forging of a legend. Every strike of his practiced sword echoes with the promise of future battles. Every victory in the yard builds the reputation that will one day challenge a throne. King Aegon watches from the royal balcony, and there is pride in the king's eyes as he observes his bastard son. More pride the courtiers whisper than he shows watching Prince Daemon struggle with his lessons. Aegor Rivers, later called Bittersteel, is different. Where Daemon inspires love, Aegor inspires respect tinged with fear. His mother's Bracken pride runs strong in his veins, and he has inherited their talent for holding grudges. At 15, he is already a formidable warrior, but more importantly, he is a born commander. He sees the bigger picture, understands politics and military strategy in ways that will make him invaluable to any cause he chooses to serve. And there is Brynden Rivers, the pale boy they call Bloodraven. His mother's Blackwood blood shows in his dark hair and his affinity for the old ways, the old magics that most maesters claim no longer exist. He watches everything, remembers everything, and even as a child, there are whispers that he dreams true dreams, that ravens carry his messages to places no raven should be able to reach. These three bastards will define the next century of Westerosi history. One will become the greatest pretender the realm has ever known. One will forge the most feared mercenary company in Essos, and one will become the most powerful spy master in the kingdom's history, the man who will hold the realm together even as it threatens to tear itself apart. But there is one more figure you must understand before this story can truly begin. She is the woman who will inspire the great love triangle that helps drive the realm to civil war. Shiera Seastar, daughter of Sirene of Lys, blessed with beauty so otherworldly that poets will write of it for centuries. She is still a child when our story begins, but already you can see the woman she will become. The woman who will have both Bloodraven and Bittersteel competing for her affections, their rivalry adding personal venom to political rebellion. As your investigation deepens, you begin to understand that what you're uncovering is not just a political story, but a deeply personal one. Every major decision in the coming wars will be shaped by family bonds, by love turned to hatred, by the peculiar dynamics that arise when bastards and true-born children grow up together in the same household. The Red Keep itself becomes your primary source document. In its stones you can read the story of a dynasty's slow collapse, the throne room, where Aegon will make his fatal deathbed decree, the royal apartments where Prince Darien will pace the floor, knowing that his father's legitimization of his bastard brothers has made his own reign infinitely more difficult, the yard where young knights practice the sword work that will soon be turned against each other. This is the world on the edge of transformation, a realm where the old certainties are about to give way to a century of chaos. Your role as historical investigator is to understand not just what happened, but why it was inevitable from the moment Aegon IV chose his desires over his dynasty's stability. The stage is set, the players are taking their positions, and in the distance you can almost hear the first whispers of the storm that is coming to tear the realm apart. The transformation of Daemon Waters from beloved bastard to dangerous pretender didn't happen overnight. It began with a gift that would change the course of history. In the great hall of the Red Keep, surrounded by the most powerful lords of Westeros, King Aegon IV made a decision that seemed generous at the time, but would prove catastrophic in hindsight. He took the ancestral sword of his house, the blade carried by Aegon the Conqueror himself, and placed it in the hands of his bastard son. The moment Daemon's fingers closed around Blackfyre's leather-wrapped hilt, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power within the realm. Blackfyre wasn't just any sword, forged in the Dragonlord's fires of old Valyria. It had tasted the blood of kings and shaped the destiny of nations. For 3 centuries, it had been the symbol of Targaryen authority, passed from king to heir in an unbroken line, until now. The court watched in stunned silence as the king smiled at his bastard son. Some later claimed they could see the future in that moment, could sense the coming storm in the way the sword seemed to belong in Daemon's hand. Others insisted it was only hindsight that made the memory seem so ominous. But everyone agreed on one thing. From the moment Daemon received Blackfyre, he carried himself differently, like a man who had been given more than a weapon, like a man who had been given a destiny. Prince Daemon stood at his father's right hand during the ceremony, his face carefully neutral, but those close to the crown prince noticed how his jaw tightened when the blade was presented. Dark Sister, the companion sword to Blackfyre, remained at his side, but somehow it seemed diminished now. A king's sword for the heir, while a bastard received the conqueror's blade. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The gift of Blackfyre was just the beginning. King Aegon's appetites were legendary, and his reign became defined by a series of scandals that historians would later call the Lysine Spring. Beautiful women from across the known world found their way to his bed, each bringing her own ambitions, her own dreams of power. Barbara Bracken believed her son Aegor might one day rule. Melissa Blackwood whispered to young Brynden about the old powers that flowed in their bloodline. Serene of Lys spoke in her musical accent about the prophecies of her homeland, about dragons that would rise and fall. Each mistress brought children, and each child represented another potential claimant, another thread in the increasingly tangled web of succession. The king delighted in his offspring, showering them with titles and honors while growing ever more distant from his lawful heir. At court functions he would call Daemon to his side, praising the young man's prowess in the yard, his noble bearing, his popularity with the people. Meanwhile, Prince Daemon stood in the shadows, dutiful but unremarkable, scholarly but uninspiring. The nobles began to choose sides even before there were official sides to choose. Those who favored the old ways, who believed in the sanctity of marriage and legitimate succession, quietly aligned themselves with Prince Daemon. But others, particularly the younger generation of knights who had grown up watching Daemon's meteoric rise, began to whisper that perhaps blood mattered more than birth order. Perhaps the strongest should rule, regardless of whether their parents had spoken vows before a septon. The whispers grew louder when Daemon began winning every tournament he entered. His skill with Blackfyre became the stuff of legend. He would ride into the lists like something out of the Age of Heroes, silver hair streaming behind him, the ancient sword gleaming in the sunlight. No knight could stand against him. No challenger could match his combination of strength, speed, and tactical brilliance. With each victory, his reputation grew, and with his reputation, his implicit claim to something greater than bastardry. But tournaments were just the beginning. When raiders struck the borderlands, Daemon led the response. When pirates threatened merchant shipping, Daemon took command of the royal fleet. Each military success added another story to his growing legend. Another reason for ambitious lords to consider what might happen if this brilliant bastard were ever to press a claim to his father's throne. The king encouraged it all, whether from genuine pride in his son's accomplishments or from some deeper desire to torment his lawful heir. Aegon made no secret of his preference for Daemon over Daeron. At feasts he would toast his bastard's victories while barely acknowledging his heir's presence. In council meetings, he would seek Daemon's opinion on military matters, while dismissing Daeron's more cautious counsel. Queen Nerys watched these developments with growing alarm. A deeply pious woman, she understood better than most what her husband's favoritism was doing to the stability of the realm. She tried to counsel restraint, tried to remind the king that his actions were creating dangerous precedents. But Aegon dismissed her concerns with the casual cruelty that had defined their marriage. What did she know of ruling? He asked. What did any woman understand about the hard choices that kings must make? The queen's isolation only deepened her relationship with her son. Prince Daemon became her confidant and her hope for the future. Together they would discuss the reforms the realm needed, the policies that might heal the divisions his father was creating. Daemon dreamed of peace with Dawn, of bringing the last independent kingdom into the Seven Kingdoms through marriage rather than conquest. He envisioned a reign based on justice and mercy rather than the caprice and excess that had marked his father's rule. But dreams of peaceful succession began to seem naive as Daemon's star continued to rise. The bastard prince, as courtiers had begun calling him, was accumulating not just military victories, but political allies. Houses that had suffered under royal displeasure found themselves favored when Daemon interceded on their behalf. Knights seeking advancement discovered that service to Daemon opened doors that service to Daemon did not. The most troubling development came in the form of ancient prophecies and mysterious omens that various court wizards and hedge witches claimed supported Daemon's cause. Old texts were discovered, or perhaps forged, that spoke of a black dragon that would save the realm from fire. Dreams were reported, carefully circulated among the superstitious, that showed Daemon sitting the Iron Throne with Blackfyre across his knees. Serene of Lys, mother of the beautiful Shiera Sea Star, was particularly gifted at spreading such tales. Her exotic beauty and foreign mystique lent credibility to her claims about prophetic visions. She spoke of reading the flames and seeing a great war coming, a war that would determine whether the realm would be ruled by the weak or the strong. Her words carried special weight because of her daughter's otherworldly beauty, which many took as a sign of divine favor. The final catalyst came when King Aegon announced his intention to conquer Dawn once and for all. Prince Daemon opposed the plan, arguing for continued diplomatic efforts to bring Dawn into the realm peacefully. But Daemon supported the war, promising to lead the van and claiming that Dawn would fall within a year if given proper military leadership. The king sided with his bastard, and suddenly the court realized they were witnessing more than just a family disagreement. They were watching the emergence of two competing visions for the future of Westeros, one represented by the cautious, scholarly, legitimate prince who sought peace and gradual reform, the other embodied by the charismatic, martial bastard prince who promised glory and conquest. As preparations for the Dornish campaign began, thoughtful observers realized that something irreversible had begun. Whatever happened in Dorne, the kingdom would never be the same. The die had been cast, though few yet understood the game being played. The realm was about to learn that sometimes the greatest threats to a dynasty come not from external enemies, but from within the royal family itself. The conquest of Dorne proved to be King Aegon's greatest folly and the catalyst that would eventually tear his dynasty apart. What began as a campaign to complete Aegon the Conqueror's work ended in humiliation, death, and the creation of the most dangerous pretender the Iron Throne had ever faced. Daemon Blackfyre rode south at the head of a glittering host, Blackfyre at his hip, and the hopes of half the kingdom on his shoulders. The army that followed him was unlike any Westeros had assembled in generations. Lords from every corner of the realm had sent their finest knights, drawn by the promise of Dornish gold and the chance to serve under the legendary bastard prince. The Reach provided heavy cavalry that could break any line. The Stormlands sent their best mounted archers. Even houses that had previously shown little interest in royal campaigns found reasons to contribute men and supplies. The contrast with previous Targaryen attempts to conquer Dorne could not have been starker. Where earlier campaigns had relied primarily on dragonfire and intimidation, this invasion promised to succeed through superior generalship and overwhelming force. Daemon had spent months studying the failures of his predecessors, consulting with veterans of border skirmishes, and developing strategies specifically designed to counter Dornish guerrilla tactics. Yet from the very beginning, the campaign was plagued by problems that had nothing to do with military strategy. The underlying tension between Prince Daemon and his half-brother, created a fundamental division within the royal family that affected every aspect of the war effort. Daemon, as heir to the throne, should have been given command of the army or at least a senior position in the campaign hierarchy. Instead, he remained in King's Landing, officially to help govern the realm in his father's absence, but in reality because his opposition to the war had cost him his father's trust. This unprecedented arrangement sent shockwaves through the noble houses of Westeros. For the first time in living memory, a bastard had been given precedence over the heir apparent in a matter of such importance. Lords who had previously remained neutral in court politics found themselves forced to choose sides. Supporting Daemon meant acknowledging that legitimacy might matter less than ability. Supporting Daemon meant standing with tradition even when that tradition appeared to be failing. The early stages of the campaign seemed to vindicate the king's decision. Daemon's forces swept through the Dornish marches with impressive efficiency, capturing border fortresses that had resisted Targaryen rule for nearly 2 centuries. His tactical innovations proved devastatingly effective against traditional Dornish defensive strategies, where previous invasions had bogged down in lengthy sieges of mountain castles. Daemon bypassed the strongest fortifications and struck directly at the economic infrastructure that supported Dornish resistance. But the Dornish, led by Prince Corin Martell, were learning too. They allowed the invaders to penetrate deep into their territory while carefully avoiding major battles. Instead of defending fixed positions, they adopted a strategy of constant harassment and strategic withdrawal that gradually wore down the invasion force. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The fierce Dornish sun took a toll on men more accustomed to the temperate climate of the northern kingdoms. Most critically, the political unity that had initially characterized the invasion began to fracture under the stress of a prolonged campaign. The first major crisis came when Lord Bracken and Lord Blackwood, whose ancestral feud had supposedly been set aside for the duration of the campaign, began openly quarreling over supply distribution and battle honors. Their dispute quickly escalated to involve other houses, creating factions within the army that mirrored the broader political divisions emerging across Westeros. Daemon found himself spending as much time mediating between his own commanders as fighting the Dornish. Meanwhile, at King's Landing, Prince Daemon was proving himself a more capable administrator than anyone had expected. With his father and half-brother absent, he took on increasing responsibility for governing the realm. His approach was markedly different from the royal style that had characterized his father's reign. Where Aegon ruled through grand gestures and personal charisma, Daemon focused on careful attention to detail and systematic reform. He streamlined the royal bureaucracy, addressed long-standing grievances from various regions, and began implementing policies designed to strengthen the realm's economic foundation. Most significantly, Daemon opened secret negotiations with Dornish representatives, seeking a diplomatic solution to the conflict that was draining the royal treasury and costing thousands of lives. These talks, conducted through intermediaries and hidden from his father, represented exactly the kind of patient, pragmatic statecraft that Daemon believed the realm needed. But they also represented a direct challenge to royal policy and a betrayal of his half-brother's military efforts. The revelation of these secret negotiations, when they inevitably came to light, created the final breach between father and son that would define the rest of Aegon's reign. The king felt personally betrayed, not just as a ruler whose policies had been undermined, but as a father whose son had chosen to work against the family's interests. From that moment forward, Aegon viewed Daemon not as an heir to be groomed for kingship, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The Dornish campaign limped to its inevitable conclusion as winter approached. Daemon had won every major battle, captured numerous fortresses, and demonstrated tactical brilliance that confirmed his reputation as one of the finest military minds of his generation. But the Dornish had never surrendered, never acknowledged defeat, never stopped their relentless campaign of harassment and resistance. The invasion force that returned to King's Landing was a fraction of its original size, depleted by casualties, desertion, and disease. More importantly, the campaign had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Westeros. Daemon returned as a hero to those who supported aggressive monarchy and military glory. His exploits in Dawn had only enhanced his legend, adding new stories to the growing collection of tales about his prowess and leadership. But he also returned to a kingdom where his half-brother had proven himself as a ruler in his own right, where the costs of military adventurism had become painfully apparent, and where the question of succession had become more complex than ever. The king's health had deteriorated significantly during the campaign, always prone to excess. Aegon had aged rapidly under the stress of military command and the disappointment of the war's inconclusive outcome. Observers noted that he moved more slowly, tired more easily, and showed increasing signs of the various ailments that would eventually kill him. For the first time, courtiers began seriously discussing what would happen when he died. The returning army brought with it not just wounded soldiers and empty treasury coffers, but also a collection of grievances and divided loyalties that would shape the coming succession crisis. Knights who had served under Daemon remained fiercely loyal to him, convinced that only poor intelligence and inadequate support from the capital had prevented complete victory. But others blamed the war's failure on the fundamental impossibility of conquering a people determined to remain free, and they looked to Prince Daemon as a leader who might pursue more realistic policies. Perhaps most ominously, the campaign had created a template for military action that operated independently of traditional royal authority. Daemon had proven that a charismatic leader with sufficient support could maintain an army in the field for months, could conduct complex operations across vast distances, and could command loyalty that transcended formal chains of command. These lessons would prove invaluable when the time came to challenge the Iron Throne itself. As the court settled back into its peacetime routines, thoughtful observers realized that the kingdom had reached a point of no return. The old certainties about legitimacy and succession had been irreparably damaged. Two competing centers of power had emerged within the royal family, each with its own supporters, its own vision for the future, and its own claim to represent the true interests of the realm. The stage was set for the final act of Aegon's reign, the deathbed decision that would transform personal rivalry into dynastic warfare. But already, in the months following the return from Dawn, careful watchers could see the kingdom beginning to divide itself into the factions that would soon tear it apart. The journey towards civil war had begun not with armies marching or swords being drawn, but with the quiet recognition that the realm now contained two potential kings, each with legitimate claims to rule, each surrounded by men willing to die for their cause. The death of King Aegon IV in 184 AC marked the end of an era and the beginning of a crisis that would define the next century of Westerosi history. His final act as king would prove to be the most consequential decision any Targaryen ruler had ever made, surpassing even Aegon the Conqueror's decision to invade Westeros in its long-term impact on the realm. As the king lay dying in his chambers, racked by the various ailments that his years of excess had brought upon him, the great lords of the realm gathered in the Red Keep to witness what they expected would be a routine transition of power. Prince Daemon, after all, had been heir for decades. His succession should have been as automatic as sunrise, but Aegon IV had never done anything the expected way, and his final hours would be no exception. The scene in the royal chambers was one that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. The king, propped up by pillows and struggling to breathe, called for the Grand Maester to bring ink and parchment. Those present assumed he wanted to dictate some final instructions for his heir, perhaps words of wisdom or warnings about the challenges that lay ahead. Instead, he issued a royal decree that stunned everyone present and sent shockwaves throughout the Seven Kingdoms. With his dying breath, King Aegon legitimized every bastard he had ever fathered, every single one, Daemon Waters became Daemon Blackfyre. Doeda Rivers became Aegor Rivers Targaryen. Brynden Rivers became Brynden Rivers Targaryen. Shiria Seastar, barely 16, but already legendary for her beauty, suddenly found herself a legitimate princess. In a single moment, the clear line of succession that had governed Westeros for nearly 2 centuries became a tangled web of competing claims. The immediate aftermath of this proclamation revealed just how unprepared the realm was for such a dramatic shift in the fundamental rules of inheritance. Prince Daeron, now King Daeron II, found himself facing not just the normal challenges of a new reign, but the unprecedented situation of ruling a kingdom where several of his half-brothers had equal legal claim to his throne. The bastards themselves reacted in ways that revealed their true characters and hinted at the conflicts to come. Daemon Blackfyre accepted his legitimization with the quiet dignity that had always marked his public persona, but those close to him noted a new intensity in his manner, a sense that he was finally free to pursue ambitions that had previously been constrained by the circumstances of his birth. The sword at his hip seemed to gleam more brightly, and when he walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, conversations stopped and heads turned. Aegor Rivers, now legally entitled to call himself Aegor Targaryen, responded with characteristic calculation. Rather than making any immediate moves, he began quietly assessing the new political landscape, reaching out to allies and potential supporters, while carefully maintaining his relationship with both his legitimate brother the king and his bastard brother the potential rival. His Bracken heritage had taught him patience, but it had also taught him that the strongest claim meant nothing without the power to enforce it. Brynden Rivers, the pale, mysterious young man already known for his unusual abilities and his network of informants, seemed almost unsurprised by the legitimization. Some whispered that he had foreseen it in his dreams, that his rumored connection to the old gods had given him advance warning of what was coming. His reaction was the most subtle, but perhaps the most significant. He immediately began strengthening his intelligence network, placing agents in key positions throughout the realm, as if he understood that knowledge would be the most valuable weapon in the coming struggle. King Daeron's response to his father's final decree revealed both his strengths and his fatal weaknesses as a ruler. True to his character, he accepted the legitimization without protest, publicly welcoming his half-brothers as true members of House Targaryen and attempting to integrate them into his administration. He offered Daemon a position as master of ships, recognizing his military talents while keeping him within the formal structure of royal government. He consulted with Brynden on matters of intelligence and internal security, utilizing his half-brother's unique abilities for the good of the realm. But Daeron's very reasonableness, his attempt to treat the legitimization as a simple administrative matter rather than the revolutionary change it represented, may have been his greatest mistake. By failing to recognize the threat that legitimized bastards posed to his own position, by attempting to accommodate rather than suppress potential rivals, he allowed the conditions for rebellion to develop under his very nose. The reaction of the great houses to the legitimization revealed the deep divisions that had been building within Westerosi society throughout Aegon's reign. Houses that had already been inclined to support Daemon saw the legitimization as validation of their belief that he was the superior choice for king. Lord Bracken, Aegor's maternal grandfather, began quietly sounding out other lords about their views on succession and legitimacy. The Euron Woods of Dorne, still smarting from their recent military defeats, saw potential allies in legitimized bastards who might be more willing to grant Dorne favorable terms than the king who had opposed war with their kingdom. Other houses, particularly those with strong ties to the faith of the Seven and traditional views on marriage and legitimacy, rallied more firmly around King Daeron. They argued that a king's final decree, no matter how legally valid, could not overturn centuries of precedent about inheritance and succession. The high towers of Old Town, with their close connections to the citadel and the faith, became particularly vocal supporters of traditional legitimacy. Perhaps most tellingly, many houses chose to remain neutral, watching and waiting to see how the situation would develop. This neutrality, while understandable from a practical standpoint, had the effect of weakening Daemon's position by denying him the unified support he needed to establish his authority decisively. Every lord who remained uncommitted was a lord who might eventually be won over by a sufficiently compelling rival claimant. The legitimization also created complications that extended far beyond the immediate question of succession. Suddenly, dozens of minor nobles found themselves facing challenges to their own inheritances from previously bastard relatives. If royal bastards could be legitimized retroactively, what precedent did that set for other families? The legal implications alone were staggering, requiring maesters and lawyers throughout the realm to reconsider fundamental assumptions about inheritance law. More broadly, the legitimization represented a direct challenge to one of the core principles that had held Westerosi society together for centuries. The distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children wasn't just a matter of law, it was a fundamental organizing principle that affected everything from inheritance rights to marriage prospects to social status. By erasing that distinction with a single decree, Aegon had called into question the very foundations of the social order. The economic implications were equally significant. Legitimized bastards suddenly had claims not just to titles and honors, but to lands and revenues that had been assumed to belong to others. The potential for legal disputes over property rights was enormous, and the uncertainty surrounding inheritance law made it difficult for lords to plan for the future or make long-term investments. As the immediate shock of the legitimization began to wear off, thoughtful observers realized that the kingdom had entered uncharted territory. Never before in Westerosi history had a monarch created so many potential claimants to the throne in a single act. Never before had the succession been thrown into such immediate doubt. The precedents that had governed royal transitions for nearly 2 centuries had been swept away, replaced by a situation so complex that no one could predict how it would ultimately be resolved. The seeds of civil war had been planted not through any act of rebellion or military aggression, but through a dying king's attempt to provide for his beloved bastards. The tragic irony would become apparent only later, when the realm learned that sometimes the greatest threats to stability come not from external enemies or internal traitors, but from the unintended consequences of good intentions carried out without sufficient consideration of their broader impact. As King Daemon began his reign, he faced challenges that no previous Targaryen monarch had confronted. The loyalty of his subjects could no longer be taken for granted. The support of the great houses had to be constantly cultivated and maintained. Most dangerously of all, he ruled a kingdom that now contained several individuals with legitimate legal claims to his throne, each surrounded by ambitious men who saw opportunity in the chaos of uncertain succession. For several years following the legitimization, it appeared that King Daemon had successfully navigated the crisis his father had created. The realm settled into what seemed like a new normal, where legitimized bastards served loyally alongside their true-born siblings, where the succession remained stable despite the unprecedented complications, and where the Targaryen dynasty had actually been strengthened by the addition of talented new members to its ranks. This period, which historians would later call the False Peace, created a dangerous illusion of stability that masked the deeper tensions building within the kingdom. To casual observers, the integration of the legitimized bastards into the royal administration appeared to be proceeding smoothly. Daemon Blackfyre served ably as master of ships, using his military experience to strengthen the royal navy and protect merchant shipping from pirates. His public loyalty to his half-brother seemed absolute, and he gave no sign of harboring any ambition beyond faithful service to the crown. Brynden Rivers had become an increasingly important figure in the royal government, his network of informants providing invaluable intelligence about potential threats to the realm's security. His loyalty to King Daemon appeared unquestionable, and his effectiveness in rooting out conspiracies and preventing disturbances made him one of the king's most trusted advisors. The whispers about his supernatural abilities and his connection to dark magic seemed like harmless court gossip rather than serious concerns about his methods. Even Aegon Rivers appeared to have found his place within the new order. Though he had chosen not to take an official position in the royal administration, he maintained cordial relationships with both the king and his other half-brothers. His expertise in military matters was frequently consulted, and his presence at court functions suggested that he had accepted the legitimization as a generous gift rather than a revolutionary change in his status. The great houses, too, seemed to be adapting to the new reality. Those who had initially expressed reservations about the legitimization gradually came to accept it as a fait accompli. The legal challenges that many had expected to emerge from disputed inheritances were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than violence. The economy continued to prosper, trade flourished, and the realm enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace and stability. King Daemon himself appeared to be thriving in his role as monarch. His careful, methodical approach to governance was producing real results. He had successfully concluded the integration of Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms through his marriage alliance with Princess Miriam Martell, achieving through diplomacy what his father had failed to accomplish through military force. His domestic policies were popular with both the nobility and the common people, and his reputation for justice and fairness was growing throughout the realm. The royal family seemed genuinely united in ways that had been impossible during Aegon's reign. Queen Maria had developed warm relationships with her husband's half-brothers, treating them as true family members rather than potential threats. The royal children, Prince Baelor and Prince Aerys, grew up considering their bastard uncles as beloved relatives rather than dangerous rivals. Family gatherings were harmonious affairs, marked by genuine affection and mutual respect. International observers praised the Targaryen dynasty's handling of what could have been a catastrophic succession crisis. Foreign ambassadors reported to their own rulers that Westeros had successfully navigated constitutional challenges that might have destroyed other kingdoms. The legitimization was held up as an example of enlightened monarchy, where merit and ability were recognized regardless of the circumstances of birth. Religious leaders, who had initially been among the strongest critics of the legitimization, gradually moderated their opposition as the practical benefits of the arrangement became apparent. The High Septon himself acknowledged that the legitimized bastards had proven themselves worthy of their new status through their service to the realm. The faith's concerns about precedent and traditional morality seemed to be giving way to acceptance of the new reality. The military establishment, too, appeared to have embraced the changes. Daemon's leadership of the Royal Navy was universally praised, and his innovations in naval tactics were being adopted throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The army remained firmly loyal to the crown, and there were no signs of the factional divisions that might have been expected following such a dramatic change in the royal family's composition. Cultural changes reflected the broader acceptance of legitimization. Bards began composing songs, celebrating the unity of the royal family and the wisdom of King Aegon's final decree. Artists created works depicting the legitimized bastards as heroic figures whose talents had been properly recognized by royal wisdom. Even the small folk, who traditionally cared little about the intricacies of noble succession, seemed to approve of rulers who had been elevated based on their abilities rather than merely their birth. The apparent success of the integration process led many to conclude that the fears about legitimization had been overblown. Critics of Aegon's decision began to seem like pessimists who had failed to understand the fundamental strength of Targaryen rule. The dynasty had faced the greatest challenge to its legitimacy in its history and had emerged stronger than ever. Academic discussions of the legitimization focused on its positive aspects as a solution to the problem of talented individuals being excluded from power solely because of their birth circumstances. Masters wrote treatises arguing that merit-based elevation of capable bastards could strengthen rather than weaken dynastic rule. The Citadel began developing new theories of governance that incorporated lessons learned from the Targaryen experience. Economic prosperity during this period seemed to validate the political arrangements. Trade increased, new construction projects were undertaken throughout the realm, and the royal treasury was healthier than it had been in decades. The stability of the succession appeared to be contributing to business confidence and long-term investment. Lords who had initially worried about the implications of legitimization began to see it as a source of strength rather than weakness. Military reforms implemented during this period further reinforced the impression of successful integration. Daemon's modernization of the Royal Navy was complemented by Aegon's contributions to army organization and Bryndon's improvements to intelligence gathering. The coordination between these efforts suggested that the legitimized bastards were working together effectively for the good of the realm rather than pursuing competing personal agendas. International diplomatic successes, particularly the final integration of Dorne, seemed to demonstrate that the new royal family structure was actually enhancing Westeros's position in the wider world. Foreign rulers who had initially questioned the legitimacy of Daemon's rule were now seeking alliances and trade agreements. The reputation of House Targaryen for stability and effectiveness was at its highest point in generations. But beneath this surface harmony, careful observers might have noticed subtler signs of tension. The legitimized bastards, for all their public loyalty, maintained their own separate households and followings. Daemon's supporters in the military remained personally devoted to him rather than to the crown as an institution. Aegon's network of contacts among the nobility was extensive and operated independently of royal oversight. Bryndon's intelligence operations, while ostensibly serving the king, were ultimately answerable only to him. The very success of the integration process might have been creating its own problems. As the legitimized bastards proved their competence and built their own power bases, they inevitably began to attract supporters who believed they might be better rulers than the king himself. The qualities that made them valuable servants of the crown also made them potentially dangerous rivals. Most ominously, the peaceful resolution of the legitimization crisis had created a false sense of security that left the realm unprepared for the challenges that were quietly building beneath the surface of apparent stability. The assumption that personal loyalty and family bonds would be sufficient to prevent conflict ignored the deeper structural problems that Aegon's decision had created within the monarchy itself. The illusion of stability that had characterized the early years of Daemon's reign began to crumble in ways that few could have predicted. The catalyst was not a grand political miscalculation or military defeat, but something far more subtle and ultimately more dangerous: the gradual erosion of personal relationships within the royal family itself. The first cracks appeared in the bond between Daemon Blackfyre and Bryndon Rivers, the two legitimized bastards who had seemed most committed to supporting their half-brother's reign. Their rivalry was initially masked by their shared dedication to the crown's interests, but underlying tensions that had existed since childhood began to surface as both men accumulated more power and influence within the royal administration. The source of their conflict was as old as human nature itself. They both loved the same woman, Shiera Seastar, now grown into the legendary beauty that poets had predicted, had become the focal point of desires that extended far beyond simple romantic attraction. Her ethereal presence at court functions drew the attention of every eligible nobleman in the realm, but it was the intensity of feeling she inspired in her own half-brothers that would ultimately help tear the kingdom apart. Daemon's attraction to Shiera was the more conventional of the two. He pursued her with the same noble bearing and chivalrous dedication that had made him beloved throughout the realm. His courtship was conducted with proper decorum, following all the established protocols for noble romance. He composed poetry in her honor, commissioned artists to capture her likeness, and made no secret of his desire to marry her, despite the complications such a union might create. Bryndon's feelings were darker and more complex. His pale, mysterious nature made him an unlikely suitor for the realm's most celebrated beauty, but his devotion to Shiera was absolute in ways that transcended conventional romance. He used his intelligence network to ensure her safety, his supernatural abilities to anticipate her needs, and his growing political power to eliminate obstacles to her happiness. His love was possessive and calculating, but also genuine in its intensity. Shiera herself seemed to enjoy the attention without committing to either suitor. Her exotic heritage from her Lycene mother had given her an understanding of court intrigue that surpassed many seasoned politicians. She recognized that her choice between the two most powerful men in the realm would have implications far beyond her personal happiness. The woman who married either Daemon or Bryndon would become a central figure in whatever political arrangements emerged from the ongoing tensions surrounding legitimacy and succession. King Daemon watched these developments with growing unease. The rivalry between his half-brothers was creating factions within his own court that threatened to undermine royal authority. Lords were beginning to align themselves not just with their preferred policies, but with their preferred romantic candidate. The personal had become political in ways that made effective governance increasingly difficult. The situation was complicated by the emergence of Aegor Rivers as a third power center within the royal family. Unlike his half-brothers, Aegor had not remained in King's Landing after the legitimization. Instead, he had chosen to spend increasing amounts of time traveling throughout the realm, ostensibly to visit various noble houses and maintain relationships built during his father's reign. But these travels had a more strategic purpose. Aegor was quietly building a network of supporters who were becoming increasingly disenchanted with Daemon's cautious approach to governance. Aegor's critique of his half-brother's reign was subtle but devastating. He never directly challenged royal authority or questioned the legitimacy of Daemon's rule. Instead, he simply observed that the kingdom seemed to lack the martial spirit that had made House Targaryen great. Where Aegon the Conqueror had unified 7 kingdoms through strength and determination, Daemon relied on negotiation and compromise. Where earlier Targaryens had inspired fear and respect in their enemies, the current king seemed content to be merely liked. These criticisms resonated particularly strongly with younger members of the nobility who had grown up hearing stories about the great conquests and glorious battles of previous generations. They looked at the current reign and saw prosperity and peace, but also stagnation and missed opportunities. Aegor gave voice to their frustrations while carefully avoiding any appearance of disloyalty to the crown. The military establishment was becoming increasingly divided along similar lines. Officers who had served under Daemon during the Dornish campaign remained fiercely loyal to him, impressed by his tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership. But others, particularly those involved in the intelligence and security services, were drawn to Bryndon's more systematic approach to protecting the realm. A third faction, concentrated among the older generation of knights and commanders, began to gravitate toward Aegor's vision of more aggressive military policies. These divisions within the military were particularly dangerous because they reflected deeper philosophical differences about the proper role of House Targaryen in Westeros. Daemon's supporters believed in the importance of personal honor and chivalric virtue, viewing the monarchy as the embodiment of the realm's highest ideals. Bryndon's faction emphasized competence and effectiveness, arguing that the crown's primary responsibility was to maintain order and security through whatever means proved necessary. Aegor's followers harked back to an earlier era when Targaryen rule was based on strength and the willingness to use it. The great houses of Westeros began to align themselves with these emerging factions in ways that reflected their own regional interests and historical grievances. The Reach, with its tradition of chivalric romance and courtly culture, found itself drawn to Daemon's noble bearing and conventional approach to leadership. The North and the Iron Islands, with their emphasis on martial virtues and direct action, were more attracted to Aegon's criticism of the current reign's peaceful policies. The more pragmatic houses of the Crown Lands and the Westerlands appreciated Bryndon's focus on effective administration and realistic policy-making. Religious institutions were also beginning to show signs of division. The faith of the Seven, which had initially opposed the legitimization but had come to accept it during the peaceful years, was now struggling with new theological questions raised by the emerging rivalries. If legitimized bastards had equal claims to rule, how should religious authorities determine which claimant represented the will of the gods? Traditional doctrines about legitimacy and divine right seemed inadequate to address the unprecedented situation. The High Septon found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to maintain religious unity, while various factions within the faith began advocating for different political positions. Some argued that Daemon's peaceful reign reflected divine approval of his rule. Others suggested that the military victories and popular support enjoyed by Daemon indicated heavenly favor. Still others claimed that Bryndon's supernatural abilities were signs of divine blessing, or, alternatively, evidence of dark magic that the faith should oppose. Economic factors were also beginning to contribute to the growing instability. The prosperity that had characterized the early years of Daemon's reign was starting to show signs of strain. The costs of maintaining 3 separate power centers within the royal family were substantial, and the uncertainty surrounding the succession was beginning to affect long-term investment and planning. Merchants and craftsmen who had initially benefited from the stability of the legitimization arrangement now found themselves hedging their bets, trying to maintain relationships with all potential future rulers. The cultural impact of these developments was perhaps most visible in the realm's artistic and intellectual life. Court poets found themselves under pressure to choose sides in their compositions, with different patrons expecting verses that celebrated their preferred claimant's virtues while subtly disparaging their rivals. Historians and chroniclers struggled to maintain objectivity while documenting events that were still unfolding and whose ultimate meaning remained unclear. The marriage market among the nobility was becoming increasingly complicated as families tried to position themselves advantageously for whatever political arrangements might emerge. Marriage alliances that had once been straightforward negotiations between houses now required careful consideration of how they might affect the balance of power between different factions within the royal family. Young nobles found their romantic choices constrained by political calculations that extended far beyond their personal preferences. As these various pressures accumulated, thoughtful observers began to realize that the kingdom was approaching another critical juncture. The peaceful integration of legitimized bastards that had seemed so successful was revealing itself to be merely the calm before a much more serious storm. The structural problems created by Aegon's deathbed decision had not been resolved. They had simply been temporarily masked by the personal loyalty and family bonds that were now beginning to fray under the pressure of competing ambitions and incompatible visions for the realm's future. The transformation of private tensions into public crisis began with a seemingly minor incident that would have far-reaching consequences. During a royal progress through the Riverlands in 196 AC, exactly 12 years after the legitimization decree, an event occurred that shattered the carefully maintained facade of family unity and revealed the depth of the divisions that had been growing beneath the surface. The royal party was traveling to Riverrun to celebrate the wedding of Lord Edmund Tully's daughter, when their journey was interrupted by reports of bandits attacking merchant caravans along the King's Road. The response to this threat became a test of leadership that exposed the fundamental differences in approach between the legitimized brothers and highlighted the growing factional divisions within the royal entourage. King Daemon's initial instinct was to send word ahead to local lords, requesting that they deal with the bandit problem through established legal channels. His approach reflected his general philosophy of governance: work through existing institutions, respect local autonomy, and avoid unnecessary escalation of minor problems. The bandits, he reasoned, were a local law enforcement issue that should be handled by local authorities with royal support if needed. Daemon Blackfyre saw the situation differently. In his view, attacks on travelers under royal protection were direct challenges to crown authority that demanded immediate and decisive response. He volunteered to take a detachment of the royal guard and hunt down the bandits personally, arguing that royal presence was necessary to demonstrate that the crown would not tolerate lawlessness. His proposal was tactically sound and politically shrewd, offering an opportunity to demonstrate leadership while protecting innocent travelers. Brynden Rivers approached the problem from yet another angle. His intelligence network had already identified the bandits as more than simple criminals. They were displaced soldiers from various minor conflicts who had turned to robbery out of desperation rather than malice. He advocated for a more comprehensive solution that would address the root causes of their criminal behavior while also demonstrating royal mercy and wisdom. His approach was characteristically subtle and long-term in its thinking. The debate over how to handle the bandit situation became a proxy for larger disagreements about governance and royal authority. Lords traveling with the royal progress found themselves forced to choose sides in what should have been a simple administrative decision. The discussions grew heated as supporters of each approach argued not just for their preferred tactics, but for their underlying philosophies of leadership. Daemon's supporters emphasized the importance of decisive action and personal courage in royal leadership. They argued that kings must be willing to take risks and face dangers directly rather than hiding behind bureaucratic procedures. The chivalric ideal demanded that those in power protect the innocent and punish the guilty through their own actions rather than delegating such responsibilities to others. Brynden's faction countered with arguments about the superior effectiveness of systematic approaches to complex problems. They maintained that gathering intelligence, understanding root causes, and implementing comprehensive solutions produced better long-term results than dramatic gestures that addressed symptoms while ignoring underlying issues. Royal authority, they argued, was best demonstrated through competent administration rather than personal heroics. King Daemon eventually chose a compromise solution that satisfied no one completely. He authorized Daemon to pursue the bandits while simultaneously ordering Brynden to investigate their origins and develop policies to prevent similar problems in the future. The decision was politically astute in that it avoided openly favoring either brother, but it also revealed the king's inability to provide clear leadership when faced with competing counsel from his most trusted advisors. The bandit hunt itself became a microcosm of the larger tensions within the realm. Daemon led his forces with characteristic brilliance, tracking down the criminals with impressive speed and efficiency. His tactical innovations and personal bravery during the pursuit enhanced his already formidable reputation among the knights and soldiers who served under him. The successful resolution of the immediate threat seemed to vindicate his approach and strengthen his position within the royal family. But Brynden's investigation revealed complications that cast the victory in a different light. The bandits were indeed displaced soldiers, but they had been driven to crime by policies implemented during Daemon's reign that had failed to provide adequate support for veterans of various military campaigns. The problem was not isolated criminal behavior, but a systematic failure of royal administration to address the needs of men who had served the crown faithfully in previous conflicts. This revelation created a new controversy that split the court along different lines than the original debate. Some argued that the discovery of administrative failures proved the superiority of Brynden's analytical approach and demonstrated the need for more systematic governance. Others maintained that the immediate threat had been effectively neutralized regardless of its underlying causes, vindicating Daemon's direct action approach. Still others suggested that the entire incident reflected poorly on King Daemon's leadership and raised questions about the competence of royal administration. The aftermath of the bandit incident revealed how seemingly minor events could trigger major political realignments when underlying tensions had reached a critical point. Lords who had previously maintained careful neutrality began to declare more open preferences for particular approaches to governance. The royal progress, which should have been a celebration of dynastic unity and strength, instead became a traveling exhibition of royal family divisions. Sharia Seastar's presence during these events added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Her reactions to the different approaches taken by her half-brothers were carefully observed by everyone present, as courtiers tried to divine her romantic preferences from her political opinions. Her apparent approval of Daemon's decisive leadership was interpreted as a sign that she favored him over Brynden, fueling speculation about potential marriage arrangements that could significantly alter the balance of power within the royal family. The progress continued to river-run, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a celebration of royal magnificence had become an uncomfortable demonstration of royal dysfunction. The wedding festivities proceeded as planned, but the underlying tensions were impossible to ignore. Private conversations among the attending nobility focused more on the implications of the bandit incident than on the ostensible purpose of their gathering. Lord Tully, as host of the celebration, found himself in the delicate position of trying to maintain proper courtesy toward all members of the royal family while avoiding any appearance of favoritism that might have political consequences. His careful neutrality was shared by many other lords who recognized that the royal progress had become a test of loyalty that could have lasting implications for their own positions within the realm's political hierarchy. The return journey to King's Landing was marked by a series of smaller incidents that further highlighted the growing divisions within the royal entourage. Disagreements over route selection, security arrangements, and ceremonial protocols became proxies for deeper philosophical differences about leadership and governance. Each decision became an opportunity for different factions to advance their preferred approaches while undermining alternatives. By the time the royal party reached the capital, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of the Targaryen dynasty. The easy cooperation that had characterized the early years of Darien's reign had been replaced by competing power centers that viewed each other with increasing suspicion and hostility. The legitimized bastards, who had once worked together harmoniously for the good of the realm, were now rivals whose conflicting approaches to governance reflected irreconcilable differences in their understanding of royal authority and responsibility. King Daemon's attempts to restore unity through private family meetings and public displays of brotherhood were increasingly ineffective. The underlying structural problems created by his father's legitimization decree were finally manifesting in ways that could not be managed through personal relationships and good intentions. The realm was beginning to fracture along lines that had been drawn years earlier, but were only now becoming visible to all who cared to look. The stage was being set for more serious conflicts, as the various factions within the royal family began to recognize that their differences were not merely tactical disagreements that could be resolved through compromise, but fundamental philosophical divisions that might ultimately prove irreconcilable. The question was no longer whether the tensions would escalate, but how quickly and in what form the escalation would occur. The event that transformed simmering tensions into open crisis came not through grand political maneuvering or military confrontation, but through the most human of catalysts, a moment of passion that shattered carefully maintained pretenses and revealed truths that had been hidden for years. It began at the tourney, held to celebrate the 10th anniversary of King Darion's marriage to Princess Mariah of Dawn. The celebration was intended to demonstrate the strength and unity of the realm, showcasing the successful integration of Dawn into the Seven Kingdoms and the stability of Targaryen rule. Lords from across Westeros gathered in King's Landing for a week of feasting, competition, and ceremonial displays of loyalty to the crown. Daemon Blackfyre entered the lists as the overwhelming favorite to win the tourney's grand championship. His reputation as the finest knight of his generation was universally acknowledged, and his victories in previous competitions had become the stuff of legend. The crowd expected to witness another demonstration of his martial supremacy, and the betting heavily favored him to claim the victor's crown and the honor of naming the tournament's Queen of Love and Beauty. The preliminary competitions proceeded as expected, with Daemon advancing easily through each round while displaying the combination of skill, strength, and tactical intelligence that had made him famous. His performances drew enthusiastic cheers from the assembled crowds and respectful acknowledgement from his fellow competitors. Even those who opposed him politically found it impossible to deny his remarkable abilities as a warrior. But the final joust produced a result that shocked everyone present and sent ripples throughout the realm. Ser Gawain Corbray of the Vale, a relatively unknown knight who had somehow advanced through the earlier rounds, managed to unseat Daemon in a single dramatic pass that left the crowd stunned and silent. The upset was so unexpected that many initially assumed it must have been an accident or fluke rather than a legitimate victory. Daemon's response to his defeat revealed depths of character that few had suspected and changed how many viewed his fitness for leadership. Rather than making excuses or demanding a rematch, he immediately sought out Ser Gawain to offer congratulations and acknowledge the superior skill displayed in their encounter. His gracious acceptance of defeat, combined with his genuine praise for his opponent's achievement, impressed even his critics and enhanced his reputation for honor and sportsmanship. However, it was what happened next that truly transformed the political landscape. According to tournament tradition, the victor had the right to crown a Queen of Love and Beauty from among the noble ladies present. Everyone expected Ser Gawain to choose someone appropriate to his station, perhaps a daughter of a minor lord or a young woman from the Vale with whom he had some connection. Instead, in a moment that would be remembered and analyzed for generations, he placed the crown of blue winter roses directly on the head of Shiera Seastar, declaring her the most beautiful woman in the Seven Kingdoms and deserving of the honor regardless of any other considerations. The gesture was unprecedented in its boldness and shocking in its implications, creating a scandal that immediately overshadowed the tournament's sporting competitions. The reaction was explosive and immediate. Daemon's supporters saw the crowning as a deliberate insult to their champion, suggesting that his defeat had been arranged specifically to deny him the opportunity to honor Shiera himself. Bryndon's faction viewed it as confirmation that outside forces were manipulating events to undermine the royal family's internal relationships. King Daemon's loyalists worried about the breach of protocol and the precedent being set for future tournaments. But the most significant reaction came from Shiera herself. Rather than graciously accepting the honor as protocol demanded, she stood and publicly thanked Ser Gawain, while making it clear that she considered his victory to be a testament to merit rather than birth or reputation. Her words seemed to endorse the idea that achievement should be recognized regardless of one's station, a philosophy that had dangerous implications for questions of succession and legitimacy. The feast following the tournament became an exercise in barely controlled tension, as various factions tried to interpret the day's events and their implications for future political arrangements. Private conversations buzzed with speculation about whether Ser Gawain had acted independently or as an agent of some larger conspiracy. The possibility that foreign powers might be attempting to influence internal Targaryen politics through manipulation of seemingly innocent social events created new anxieties about the security of the realm. More troubling was the revelation that emerged in the days following the tournament. Investigations conducted by Bryndon's intelligence network revealed that Ser Gawain Corbray had recently received substantial financial support from sources connected to the Golden Company, the mercenary organization founded by Targaryen exiles and legitimized bastards from previous generations. The discovery raised the terrifying possibility that the defeat of Daemon and the crowning of Shiera had been orchestrated by enemies of the dynasty who understood how personal relationships could be manipulated to create political instability. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If foreign agents could influence the outcomes of tournaments and the selection of queens of love and beauty, what other aspects of royal life might be subject to manipulation? The security measures that had seemed adequate for protecting against conventional threats appeared woefully inadequate when faced with sophisticated psychological warfare designed to exploit the personal relationships and emotional vulnerabilities of the royal family. King Daemon's response to these discoveries demonstrated both his strengths and his fatal weaknesses as a ruler. He immediately ordered comprehensive investigations into the backgrounds and connections of all tournament participants, seeking to identify any other potential agents of foreign influence. His systematic approach to uncovering the scope of the threat was methodical and thorough, reflecting his characteristic attention to detail and preference for complete information before taking action. However, the king's handling of the personal dimensions of the crisis proved far less effective. His attempts to address the romantic tensions between his half-brothers through private family conferences only highlighted how far beyond his control the situation had evolved. The revelation that external enemies were actively working to exploit these tensions made it clear that what had seemed like private family matters had become issues of national security. Daemon's reaction to the discovery of foreign manipulation was characteristically direct and honorable. He publicly declared that his defeat, regardless of its circumstances, had been legitimately achieved within the rules of the tournament and should stand without challenge. His refusal to seek to overturn the result, even when presented with evidence of potential conspiracy, enhanced his reputation for integrity, but also demonstrated a political naivety that worried his supporters. Bryndon's response was more calculating, and ultimately more dangerous to the stability of the realm. He expanded his intelligence operations dramatically, seeking to identify and neutralize all potential foreign agents operating within Westeros. His methods became increasingly intrusive and harsh as he pursued what he saw as existential threats to the dynasty. The expansion of his surveillance apparatus created new tensions with nobles who found themselves subject to investigation despite their loyalty to the crown. The tournament scandal also revealed the extent to which Aegon Rivers had been building independent power structures during his travels throughout the realm. His network of contacts proved invaluable in identifying potential security threats, but it also demonstrated that he had been operating essentially as an independent political actor rather than as a loyal servant of his half-brother's crown. The recognition of his capabilities came with the uncomfortable realization that those same capabilities could be turned against royal authority if his loyalty ever wavered. Perhaps most significantly, the events surrounding the tournament marked the end of any pretense that the legitimized bastards could continue to function as a unified support system for King Daemon's reign. The combination of romantic rivalry, political disagreement, and external manipulation had created divisions that could no longer be papered over through appeals to family loyalty or shared interests in dynastic stability. The realm had reached a point where the structural problems created by Aegon the Unworthy's deathbed legitimization could no longer be managed through good intentions and careful diplomacy. The legitimized bastards who had been intended as additional strength for House Targaryen were revealing themselves to be potential threats to its continued survival, not through any inherent disloyalty, but through the inevitable conflicts that arose when multiple individuals with legitimate claims to power found themselves competing for limited resources and recognition. The revelation of foreign manipulation at the tournament was merely the visible tip of a conspiracy that had been developing for years, one that reached far deeper into the fabric of Westerosi society than anyone had imagined. What emerged through Bryndon Rivers' increasingly desperate investigations was a network of influence and corruption that challenged everything the realm thought it knew about loyalty, legitimacy, and the true sources of political power. The Golden Company's involvement had not been a recent development or an opportunistic attempt to exploit existing tensions. Documents discovered in hidden caches throughout King's Landing revealed a systematic campaign of infiltration and manipulation that had been ongoing since the legitimization decree itself. Foreign gold had been flowing into Westeros for over a decade, carefully distributed to influence key decisions and gradually shift public opinion in favor of concepts that would ultimately benefit potential pretenders to the Iron Throne. The scope of the infiltration was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its effectiveness. Bards throughout the realm had been subtly encouraged to compose songs that celebrated the virtues of strong leadership over legitimate birth. Merchants had been provided with favorable trading terms that made them wealthy advocates for policies that weakened traditional succession laws. Even members of the faith had been influenced through charitable donations that came with gentle suggestions about the moral superiority of merit-based advancement over hereditary privilege. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that several major noble houses had been receiving regular payments disguised as loans, gifts, or trading profits. These financial relationships had not necessarily purchased outright treason, but they had created subtle pressures and obligations that influenced decision-making in ways that gradually undermined royal authority. Lords who believed themselves to be acting on principle were actually responding to incentives carefully crafted by foreign agents who understood Westerosi culture better than most natives. The Blackwood-Bracken feud, that ancient rivalry that had shaped Riverland's politics for centuries, had been deliberately exacerbated through agents provocateurs who ensured that every minor dispute escalated into major conflict. The constant warfare between these houses served the conspiracy's interests by weakening potential royal supporters and creating instability that made dramatic change seem preferable to continued chaos. Both houses had unknowingly been manipulated into serving foreign interests while believing they were pursuing their traditional rivalry. House Bracken's support for Aegon Rivers, which had seemed like natural family loyalty, was revealed to have been encouraged and financially supported by external sources. The proud lords of Stonehenge had not been bought, but they had been provided with resources and opportunities that made their preferred political position seem more viable than they might otherwise have been. Their genuine beliefs about Aegon's superiority as a potential ruler had been reinforced by carefully orchestrated circumstances that proved his competence while highlighting his rivals' weaknesses. Similarly, many of the houses that had gravitated toward Daemon Blackfyre had been influenced by agents who understood exactly how to appeal to their particular interests and prejudices. Lords who valued martial prowess above all else had been provided with opportunities to witness Daemon's military skills. Those who worried about the realm's future had been given carefully selected information about threats that only strong leadership could address. The manipulation had been so subtle that its targets remained convinced they were making independent judgments based on objective evidence. The financial networks supporting this conspiracy were sophisticated beyond anything previously seen in Westerosi politics. Gold from Tyrosh, Lys, and Volantis flowed through a complex web of trading companies, mercenary organizations, and religious institutions. The Iron Bank of Braavos, while maintaining official neutrality, had provided crucial coordination services that allowed the conspiracy to operate across multiple free cities without triggering suspicion from any single government. The ultimate goal of this foreign interference was not to place any particular pretender on the Iron Throne, but to create conditions of perpetual instability that would prevent Westeros from becoming a unified threat to Associ interests. A realm torn by civil war could not project power across the narrow sea or interfere with the profitable slave trade that formed the economic foundation of several major free cities. The legitimization crisis had provided an opportunity to create exactly the kind of internal conflict that would serve foreign interests for generations to come. Brynden River's discovery of this conspiracy transformed his understanding of his role within the royal family and his responsibilities to the realm. No longer was he simply managing intelligence operations designed to protect his half-brother's reign from conventional threats. He was now engaged in a shadow war against enemies who understood psychological manipulation better than most people understood conventional warfare. The stakes were not just dynastic succession, but the independence of Westeros itself. His response was characteristically systematic and ruthless. Working in complete secrecy, he began dismantling the foreign networks piece by piece, identifying agents and cutting off financial flows while carefully avoiding actions that might alert the conspiracy to the extent of his knowledge. His methods became increasingly harsh as he realized that traditional approaches to law enforcement were inadequate when dealing with threats that operated through influence rather than direct action. The revelation of foreign manipulation also cast new light on Daemon Blackfyre's growing popularity and the nature of his support base. Many of his most devoted followers were genuinely motivated by their admiration for his character and abilities, but others had been subtly influenced by propaganda campaigns designed to enhance his reputation and diminish that of his rivals. The distinction between authentic support and manufactured enthusiasm became impossible to determine, poisoning relationships that had once been based on trust and mutual respect. Daemon himself was devastated by the discovery that his achievements might have been aided by foreign interference. His sense of personal honor made it impossible for him to accept victories that had been tainted by external manipulation, even when that manipulation had been conducted without his knowledge or consent. The realization that enemies of the realm had been using his reputation and accomplishments to serve their own purposes filled him with a rage that was all the more dangerous for being entirely justified. King Aegon found himself facing a crisis that was simultaneously foreign and domestic, political and personal. The foreign conspiracy threatened the independence of his realm, but addressing it required actions that would inevitably damage relationships with nobles who had been influenced by it. Some of these lords were genuinely treasonous, but others were simply the unwitting victims of sophisticated manipulation. Determining which was which, and responding appropriately to each category, required judgments that could easily destroy the remaining unity within his kingdom. The conspiracy's most brilliant aspect was how it had used legitimate grievances and real political differences to serve foreign interests. The concerns about Daemon's peaceful policies were genuine, as was the admiration for Daemon's military prowess. The financial difficulties faced by various noble houses were real, as were the social pressures created by rapid political change. By amplifying and exploiting these authentic issues, the conspirators had created a situation where opposing foreign influence required suppressing legitimate domestic political discourse. Shiera Seastar's position became particularly precarious as investigations revealed the extent to which her romantic choices had been manipulated by external forces. The tournament incident that had seemed like a simple breach of protocol was now understood as part of a sophisticated campaign to manipulate her relationships with her half-brothers and thereby influence the succession crisis. Her every action, her every word had been observed and analyzed by foreign agents seeking to exploit her influence over the most powerful men in the realm. The psychological toll of these discoveries on the royal family was immense. Relationships that had been strained by political disagreements became poisoned by suspicion and mistrust. Every past interaction had to be re-examined in light of new knowledge about foreign manipulation. Genuine emotions became suspect, and authentic political positions appeared to be potentially corrupted by external influence. The conspiracy had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of paranoia and division that would make effective governance impossible even if the immediate foreign threat could be neutralized. As winter approached in 200 AC, the realm stood on the brink of a crisis that would test not just the strength of Targaryen rule, but the very possibility of Westerosi independence. The legitimized bastards, who had been intended to strengthen the dynasty, were now viewed with suspicion by many who wondered whether their actions served foreign interests. The king, who should have been able to rely on family loyalty, found himself isolated by the necessity of treating his own brothers as potential security threats. The stage was set for decisions that would determine not just which Targaryen would rule, but whether any Targaryen would be strong enough to resist the foreign forces that had invested so heavily in the realm's destruction. The discovery of the foreign conspiracy forced King Aegon to make the most difficult decision of his reign. He convened what would later be known as the Secret Council, a clandestine gathering of his most trusted advisors that would meet in the deep chambers beneath Dragonstone, far from the ears of potential spies and the influence of foreign gold. The participants in these discussions would shape not only the response to the immediate crisis, but the fundamental character of Targaryen rule for generations to come. The council included figures whose very presence in the same room represented the complexity of the challenges facing the realm. Grand Maester Monkun brought the accumulated wisdom of the Citadel and access to historical precedents that might guide their decision-making. Lord Commander Alan Stokeworth of the King's Guard provided military expertise and unwavering loyalty to the crown. Most crucially, both Daemon Blackfyre and Brynden Rivers were included, despite the growing tensions between them and the questions about their respective roles in the developing crisis. The first sessions of the Secret Council were devoted to understanding the full scope of the foreign threat. Brynden's intelligence network had uncovered evidence of conspiracy in every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, but the challenge lay in determining which threats were genuine and which were exaggerations born of paranoia. The revelation that trusted allies might be compromised had created an atmosphere of suspicion that threatened to paralyze effective governance. Grand Maester Monkun provided historical context that was both reassuring and terrifying. Previous Targaryen rulers had faced external threats and internal division, but never simultaneously, and never with such sophisticated methods of manipulation. The Maester's records contained accounts of foreign gold influencing Westerosi politics during the Dance of Dragons, but nothing approaching the systematic campaign that had been uncovered. The realm was facing challenges that were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Lord Commander Stokeworth's military assessment was equally sobering. The traditional approaches to defending the realm against external threats assumed that enemies would use conventional methods of warfare. Armies could be defeated, fleets could be destroyed, and castles could be defended. But how could the crown protect itself against enemies who fought with gold rather than steel, who conquered through influence rather than force? The very foundations of military strategy seemed inadequate to address the new realities of political warfare. Danem's contributions to these discussions revealed the depth of his understanding of both military tactics and political dynamics. His analysis of how the conspiracy had exploited existing divisions within the realm was penetrating and accurate. He recognized that the foreign agents had succeeded because they had identified genuine problems within Westerosi society and then exacerbated them rather than creating artificial conflicts. The solution, he argued, required addressing the underlying issues that had made the realm vulnerable to manipulation. Brynden's presentations were methodical and comprehensive, laying out the full network of foreign influence with the precision of a master craftsman dissecting a complex mechanism. His recommendations were ruthless but logical: systematic elimination of compromised individuals, complete restructuring of government finances to prevent foreign penetration, and the creation of a permanent intelligence service capable of detecting and countering future threats. His proposals would fundamentally transform the relationship between ruler and subject, creating unprecedented levels of royal control over information and communication. The philosophical divisions that emerged during these discussions reflected deeper questions about the nature of legitimate government and the proper relationship between security and freedom. Daemon argued for approaches that would preserve traditional liberties while addressing the immediate threats through enhanced military preparedness and diplomatic initiatives. He believed that the realm's strength lay in the willing loyalty of free subjects rather than the fearful obedience of a controlled population. Brynden advocated for more radical changes that would sacrifice some traditional freedoms in exchange for security against sophisticated threats that conventional approaches could not address. His vision of royal government involved extensive surveillance, careful control of information, and the systematic elimination of potential threats before they could develop into actual dangers. He argued that the foreign conspiracy had succeeded precisely because the realm had been too trusting and too open to manipulation. King Daemon found himself torn between approaches that each addressed different aspects of the crisis, while creating new problems of their own. Daemon's proposals would preserve the character of Westerosi society, but might leave it vulnerable to continued foreign manipulation. Bryndon's recommendations would provide security against external threats, but might transform the realm into something unrecognizable and potentially tyrannical. The emotional toll of these discussions on all participants was immense. Family relationships that had already been strained by political disagreements were further damaged by the necessity of treating loved ones as potential security threats. Every past conversation had to be re-examined for signs of foreign influence. Every future interaction would be shadowed by suspicion and mistrust that might never fully heal. Queen Miriah of Dawn, though not formally part of the Secret Council, provided crucial perspective as someone who had observed the developing crisis from a unique vantage point. Her insights into how Dornish integration had been used as a model for foreign manipulation were particularly valuable. She revealed how agents had approached Dornish nobles with arguments that their special status within the realm made them natural allies for other groups seeking to change traditional power structures. The conspiracy had been using successful royal policies as templates for subversion. The council's discussions also revealed how the legitimization decree had created vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the obvious succession questions. The precedent of royal bastards being elevated to positions of power and influence had been used by foreign agents to argue that other traditional hierarchies were similarly subject to change. Noble houses with ambitious younger sons or cadet branches had been subtly encouraged to believe that merit might triumph over birth order if circumstances were properly arranged. Religious authorities, represented by the High Septon's most trusted advisors, provided another perspective on the crisis that highlighted its spiritual dimensions. The faith of the Seven had been infiltrated by agents who argued that divine will was expressed through strength and success rather than through traditional concepts of legitimacy and inheritance. These theological arguments had found receptive audiences among religious figures who were genuinely concerned about moral decay within the nobility and who saw political change as potentially beneficial for spiritual renewal. The merchant classes had been particularly susceptible to foreign influence because their interests often conflicted with traditional noble privileges and royal policies. Traders who had been frustrated by restrictions on their activities found themselves receiving support and encouragement from agents who promised that political changes would bring economic opportunities. The conspiracy had succeeded in creating a coalition of interests that crossed traditional social boundaries. As the Secret Council's meetings continued through the winter months, a consensus began to emerge around the recognition that the realm faced an existential threat that could not be addressed through conventional means. The foreign conspiracy had succeeded in weaponizing the very diversity and complexity of Westerosi society against itself. Every strength of the realm had been turned into a vulnerability, every virtue into a weakness that could be exploited. The Council's final recommendations would represent a compromise between competing visions of how to preserve Targaryen rule and Westerosi independence. But the process of reaching that compromise revealed how deeply the foreign conspiracy had succeeded in dividing the realm against itself. Even the most loyal and capable servants of the crown found themselves disagreeing about fundamental questions of governance, security, and the proper balance between freedom and order. The decisions that emerged from these secret deliberations would shape the response to the developing crisis and determine whether the realm could survive the challenge that foreign enemies had spent years preparing. But they would also reveal whether the bonds of family loyalty and shared purpose that had sustained House Targaryen through previous crises would be strong enough to survive the pressures that external manipulation had created within the royal family itself. The winter of 200 AC would be remembered as the season when the realm held its breath, sensing that momentous changes were approaching but unable to predict their exact nature or timing. The Secret Council's deliberations had produced a series of recommendations that King Daemon knew would fundamentally alter the character of his reign and possibly the future of House Targaryen itself. The implementation of these decisions would require a level of political courage and personal sacrifice that few rulers in Westerosi history had ever been called upon to demonstrate. The first and most painful recommendation involved the systematic removal of potentially compromised individuals from positions of authority throughout the realm. The evidence of foreign manipulation was compelling, but it was also incomplete and circumstantial in many cases, distinguishing between those who were genuinely treasonous and those who were merely the unwitting victims of sophisticated influence campaigns required judgments that could easily destroy innocent lives and loyal relationships. Daemon Blackfyre volunteered to remove himself from his official positions and withdraw from court, recognizing that his continued presence would be interpreted as either royal weakness or dangerous tolerance of potential threats. His offer was both noble and heartbreaking, representing the kind of personal sacrifice that had always characterized his approach to service. But it also demonstrated how the foreign conspiracy had succeeded in weaponizing virtue itself, turning the very qualities that made him admirable into sources of political vulnerability. Brynden Rivers accepted expanded responsibilities for internal security with characteristic grimness, understanding better than anyone the psychological and moral costs of the methods he would be forced to employ. His transformation from royal advisor to spymaster would require him to sacrifice many of his remaining human connections in service of abstract concepts of duty and loyalty. The realm would be safer under his protection, but he would become something less than fully human in the process. The financial reforms recommended by the Secret Council were equally radical in their implications. Every source of royal revenue would be scrutinized for potential foreign influence, and new accounting methods would be implemented to trace the flow of gold throughout the kingdom. These measures would prevent future manipulation through economic pressure, but they would also require an unprecedented level of royal oversight that might stifle the commercial activity that had made the realm prosperous. King Daemon's personal response to the crisis revealed both his strengths and the tragic limitations that would ultimately doom his efforts to preserve dynastic unity. He accepted the necessity of harsh measures while refusing to abandon his fundamental belief in the possibility of reconciliation and redemption. His attempts to implement security reforms while maintaining family bonds created contradictions that served neither objective effectively. Queen Maria's role during this period was crucial but largely hidden from public view. Her Dornish heritage provided her with insights into how foreign influence operated, but it also made her a potential target for suspicion from those who questioned the loyalty of recent additions to the royal family. Her quiet support for her husband's difficult decisions helped sustain him through the moral challenges of governing during a crisis, but it could not resolve the fundamental tensions that were tearing the realm apart. The great houses of Westeros responded to the emerging crisis with a mixture of confusion, fear, and opportunism that reflected their diverse interests and loyalties. Some lords who had been influenced by foreign gold genuinely repented when confronted with evidence of their manipulation, but others doubled down on their positions rather than acknowledging their errors. The atmosphere of suspicion and accusation made it difficult to distinguish between genuine loyalty and calculated performance. House Bracken's situation exemplified the complex moral challenges created by the foreign conspiracy. Lord Bracken had genuinely believed that his support for Aegor Rivers was motivated by family loyalty and political principle. The discovery that this support had been encouraged and enabled by external enemies forced him to question not just his political positions, but his understanding of his own motivations and moral character. His anguish was shared by numerous other lords who found themselves in similar positions. The military implications of the crisis were particularly troubling. because they affected the realm's ability to defend itself against conventional threats while addressing the unconventional challenges posed by foreign manipulation. Daemon's voluntary withdrawal from active service deprived the crown of its most capable military commander at exactly the moment when strong leadership was most needed. The suspicion surrounding potentially compromised officers made it difficult to maintain unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Religious institutions faced their own versions of the same challenges that were affecting secular authorities. The faith of the Seven had been infiltrated by agents promoting theological interpretations that served foreign interests, but identifying and removing these influences required judgments about spiritual matters that secular authorities were poorly equipped to make. The cooperation between crown and faith that was necessary to address the crisis created precedents that might compromise religious independence in the future. The psychological impact of the revelations about foreign manipulation extended far beyond the immediate political implications. Ordinary citizens found themselves questioning the authenticity of their own beliefs and loyalties, wondering whether their political opinions had been shaped by influences they had never recognized. The discovery that their thoughts and feelings had been deliberately manipulated created a sense of violation that was difficult to address through conventional means of reassurance or explanation. Shira Seastar's position during this period was particularly precarious and psychologically devastating. The revelation that her romantic relationships had been systematically manipulated by foreign agents forced her to question not just the sincerity of her suitors, but the authenticity of her own emotions. Every interaction she had ever had with Daemon Brynden or any other potential romantic partner now seemed potentially tainted by external influence. Her beauty, which had once been a source of power and pleasure, became a burden that made her a target for manipulation. The cultural and artistic life of the realm was profoundly affected by the revelations about foreign influence. Bards who had unknowingly spread propaganda disguised as entertainment faced questions about their integrity and judgment. Artists who had received patronage from compromised sources found their work subject to political interpretation. The free exchange of ideas and creative expression that had characterized the peaceful years of Darien's reign became constrained by suspicion and fear. As spring approached in 201 AC, it became clear that the realm had reached a point of no return. The measures necessary to address the foreign conspiracy would fundamentally transform the relationship between rulers and subjects, between the crown and the nobility, between security and freedom. The Westeros that emerged from this crisis would be different in essential ways from the realm that Aegon the Conqueror had founded and that his descendants had ruled for nearly 2 centuries. The final preparations for implementing the Secret Council's recommendations required King Daemon to make peace with the knowledge that his reign would be remembered not for its achievements in diplomacy and domestic governance, but for the painful necessity of sacrificing traditional liberties in defense of independence. The foreign conspiracy had succeeded in forcing the realm to choose between its values and its survival, a choice that would leave scars regardless of which option was selected. The stage was set for revelations that would expose the full scope of the threats facing House Targaryen and force decisions that would determine whether the dynasty could survive the challenges that foreign enemies had spent years preparing. The truth that emerged would be more shocking and more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, revealing not just the scope of foreign manipulation but the fundamental vulnerabilities in Westerosi society that had made such manipulation possible. The truth that shattered everything came not through careful investigation or political maneuvering, but through the most unexpected source imaginable. In the spring of 201 AC, as King Daemon prepared to implement the harsh measures recommended by the Secret Council, a dying confession from an unlikely witness would reveal that the foreign conspiracy was merely the surface layer of a deception so profound that it called into question the very foundations of Targaryen legitimacy itself. The confessor was Ser Termence Toyne, the former Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, who had been dismissed in disgrace years earlier for his affair with one of King Aegon's mistresses. Facing death from a wasting disease and tormented by guilt over his role in events that had spiraled far beyond his original intentions, he sent word to King Aegon requesting a final audience. What he revealed in that private meeting would transform the succession crisis from a manageable political problem into an existential threat to the dynasty itself. Sir Terence's confession began with admissions that were shocking but not entirely surprising. He had indeed been compromised by foreign agents, accepting gold from Taroshi merchants in exchange for information about royal security arrangements and family dynamics. His dismissal from the Kingsguard had been orchestrated to provide him with a cover story for his subsequent activities as a foreign agent. These revelations were damaging but consistent with what Brynden River's investigations had already uncovered about the scope of external manipulation. But then Sir Terence revealed something that struck at the heart of everything the realm believed about its ruling dynasty. The foreign conspiracy, he confessed, had not created the succession crisis through manipulation of existing tensions. Instead, they had been working for years to conceal a truth that would have prevented the crisis from ever developing. The legitimization decree that had seemed like King Aegon's final attempt to provide for his beloved bastards had actually been forged after his death by a conspiracy that included members of the royal family itself. The dying king had never legitimized his bastards. His final decree had been a conventional document transferring power to Prince Daemon and providing modest provisions for his illegitimate children. The legitimization proclamation had been created by a small group of conspirators who understood that civil war would serve their interests better than peaceful succession. They had used the chaos following the king's death to substitute their own version of his final wishes, confident that no one would dare question a royal decree during such a sensitive period. The conspirators had included Grand Maester Munchen, who had been secretly working with foreign agents for years, and several other trusted advisors who had access to royal documents and the authority to authenticate them. But most shocking of all was the revelation that Daemon Blackfyre himself had known about the forgery from the beginning. His acceptance of the legitimization, his claim to royal status, and his growing challenge to his half-brother's authority had all been based on his knowledge that he possessed no legal right to any of it. Daemon had not been an unwitting victim of foreign manipulation or the innocent beneficiary of his father's generosity. He had been an active participant in a conspiracy designed to create the conditions necessary for his own rise to power. His reputation for honor and nobility, the qualities that had made him beloved throughout the realm, had been carefully cultivated performances designed to build support for an eventually rebellion that he had been planning since the moment of King Aegon's death. The implications of this revelation were staggering in their scope and devastating in their personal impact. King Aegon, who had spent years trying to accommodate his half-brothers and maintain family unity, learned that his greatest act of generosity in accepting the legitimization had been based on a fundamental deception. His attempts to share power with men he believed were his legal equals had actually been negotiations with usurpers who had stolen their claims through forgery and fraud. Brynden River's reaction to the confession was characteristically intense and methodical. His intelligence network immediately began investigating every aspect of Sir Terence's claims, seeking corroborating evidence and identifying other participants in the conspiracy. What they discovered confirmed the worst fears and revealed additional layers of deception that extended the conspiracy's reach even further into the structures of royal government. The forged legitimization decree was indeed a masterwork of deception, created with such skill that it had fooled even expert document examiners. The conspirators had used authentic royal parchment, genuine seals and ink that matched other documents from the same period. They had even arranged for multiple witnesses to the supposed deathbed scene, all of whom had been either bribed or coerced into supporting their version of events. More troubling was the discovery that the conspiracy had anticipated potential exposure and had prepared contingency plans designed to maximize the damage to royal authority if their deception was ever revealed. Documents hidden throughout the realm were prepared for distribution, claiming that King Daemon himself had been involved in forging the legitimization as part of a complex plot to eliminate his rivals while maintaining plausible deniability. The conspiracy had weaponized the truth itself, ensuring that revealing their deception would create as much damage as allowing it to continue. Queen Mariah's response to these revelations demonstrated both her political sophistication and her genuine devotion to her husband's welfare. She immediately understood that the truth about the forged decree, while clearing Daemon of any moral responsibility for the legitimization, would actually weaken his political position by revealing how thoroughly he had been deceived by those he trusted most. The image of a king who could be fooled by his own advisors and half-brothers would be almost as damaging as the original legitimization crisis. The personal betrayal that King Daemon felt upon learning the truth about Daemon's deception was profound in ways that transcended political considerations. The half-brother he had genuinely loved and respected, the man whose abilities he had admired and whose loyalty he had never questioned, had been systematically lying to him for years while planning to steal his throne. The generosity and accommodation that Daemon had shown in accepting the legitimization was revealed to have been responses to manufactured circumstances designed to exploit his noble character. Daemon's own position became impossible to maintain. Once Ser Terence's confession became known to the inner circle of royal advisors, his years of carefully constructed reputation for honor and integrity crumbled as the scope of his deception became clear. The foreign manipulation that had seemed to explain his growing challenge to royal authority was revealed to have been merely a supporting element in a much more personal betrayal that struck at the heart of family relationships. The strategic implications of the revelation were as complex as the personal ones. Daemon's supporters throughout the realm had based their loyalty on their belief in his legitimate claim to royal status and their admiration for his character. Learning that both foundations for their support had been fabricated would force them to choose between continuing to support a known usurper or abandoning a cause in which they had invested their honor and their future prospects. Some of Daemon's most devoted followers refused to accept the truth of Ser Terence's confession, arguing that it was itself a fabrication designed to discredit their champion. Their loyalty to Daemon had transcended legal technicalities and become a matter of personal faith in his worthiness to rule. The revelation that his claim was fraudulent only convinced them that the existing system of legitimacy was so corrupt that it deserved to be overthrown entirely. Others, particularly those who had joined Daemon's cause, primarily because of their belief in his legal rights, found themselves facing a moral crisis that challenged their understanding of loyalty, honor, and political obligation. If Daemon's claim was false, were they rebels and traitors for having supported him, or were they victims of a deception so sophisticated that their error was understandable and forgivable? The revelation also cast new light on Aegon IV's role in the developing crisis. His gradual withdrawal from court and his building of independent power structures now appeared to have been motivated by knowledge of the conspiracy rather than simple political ambition. His careful neutrality between his half-brothers was revealed to have been a calculated strategy designed to position himself advantageously, regardless of how the truth about the legitimization eventually emerged. As the full implications of Ser Terence's confession became clear to the small group of people who were initially informed about it, King Daemon faced the most difficult decision of his reign. Revealing the truth about the forged legitimization would expose the conspiracy and legally clear him of any responsibility for the crisis, but it would also demonstrate his weakness as a ruler and potentially destabilize the realm even further. Concealing the truth would preserve his political position, but would require him to continue governing based on a fundamental deception that had already caused immense damage to the kingdom. King Daemon's decision to reveal the truth about the forged legitimization decree would prove to be both the most courageous and the most catastrophic choice of his reign. The announcement made during a great council session in the late spring of 201 AC sent shockwaves throughout the Seven Kingdoms that would reshape the political landscape for generations to come. The revelation that the succession crisis had been based on fundamental deceptions destroyed what remained of unity within the realm and set in motion the events that would lead directly to the First Blackfyre Rebellion. The immediate reaction to the king's announcement varied dramatically depending on the audience's previous loyalties and their assessment of the evidence presented. Lords who had remained faithful to Daemon throughout the crisis felt vindicated in their loyalty, but also betrayed by their discovery of how thoroughly they had been deceived by people they had trusted. Those who had supported Daemon found themselves facing the uncomfortable choice between abandoning a cause they had believed just or continuing to support what they now knew to be a fraudulent claim. Daemon Blackfyre's response to the public exposure of his role in the conspiracy revealed the complexity of his character and the depth of his commitment to his cause. Rather than attempting to deny the accusations or flee the realm, he publicly acknowledged his knowledge of the forged decree, while simultaneously declaring that legal technicalities could not change the fundamental reality of his fitness to rule. His argument that merit and popular support mattered more than documentary legitimacy appealed to those who had supported him for his personal qualities, rather than his legal claims. This defiant stance transformed Daemon from a pretender with a fraudulent claim into something far more dangerous, a revolutionary who explicitly rejected the traditional basis of royal authority. By arguing that his worth as a leader transcended legal legitimacy, he was challenging not just King Daemon's right to rule, but the entire system of hereditary monarchy that had governed Westeros since the conquest. His supporters could now frame their cause as a struggle for meritocratic governance rather than simple rebellion against lawful authority. The revelation also exposed the full extent of foreign involvement in the conspiracy and its sophisticated understanding of Westerosi political dynamics. The evidence presented by Brynden River's investigation revealed that the associate agents had not simply bribed a few corrupt officials, but had identified and exploited fundamental weaknesses in the realm's political structures. They had recognized that the legitimization crisis would create exactly the kind of instability that would prevent Westeros from projecting power across the narrow sea. Grand Maester Munken's role in the conspiracy was particularly shocking because it revealed how thoroughly foreign agents had penetrated the most trusted institutions of the realm. His position had given him access to royal documents, authority to authenticate official proclamations, and the respect of nobles throughout the kingdom. His betrayal demonstrated that no institution, no matter how venerable or trusted, was immune to corruption when faced with sophisticated foreign manipulation. The exposure of the conspiracy also revealed the complex motivations of its various participants. Some, like Munken, had been genuine traitors motivated by foreign gold and promises of power in whatever regime emerged from the chaos. Others had been idealistic reformers who believed that changing the system of succession might strengthen the realm by ensuring that the most capable rulers reached power. Still others had been coerced or manipulated into participation through threats, blackmail, or carefully constructed deceptions about the conspiracy's true purposes. Adada Rivers emerged from these revelations in a particularly complex position. His knowledge of the conspiracy and his careful neutrality throughout the crisis suggested sophisticated political calculation, but his ultimate loyalties remained unclear even after the truth was revealed. Some suspected that he had been planning to support whichever brother emerged victorious, while others believed that he had been positioning himself to claim power for himself if both Daemon and Daemon were discredited by the revelations. The reaction of the great houses to the exposure of the conspiracy revealed the deep divisions that had developed within Westerosi society during the years of uncertainty and manipulation. Some lords who had supported Daemon based on their belief in his legitimacy immediately withdrew their support and proclaimed renewed loyalty to King Daemon. Others argued that the revelation of the conspiracy only proved that the existing system was too corrupt to deserve preservation, and that revolution might be necessary to restore honor to governance. House Bracken's response exemplified the moral complexity of the situation facing noble families throughout the realm. Lord Bracken had genuinely believed that supporting his grandson Aegon Rivers was both a family obligation and a patriotic duty. The discovery that his political positions had been influenced by foreign manipulation forced him to question not just his judgment, but his understanding of his own motivations and moral character. The faith of the Seven found itself in an equally difficult position, as religious authorities struggled to provide moral guidance in a situation that seemed to have no clear ethical precedents. Traditional doctrines about legitimacy and divine right offered little guidance when the question was whether subjects owed loyalty to a king who had been deceived, or to a pretender whose claim was fraudulent but whose character might be superior. Some septons argued that divine will was expressed through the revelation of truth, while others maintained that political stability was a religious value that transcended questions about the origins of particular claims to power. The economic implications of the revelations were immediate and severe. The uncertainty surrounding the succession had already begun to affect trade and investment, but the exposure of foreign manipulation created new anxieties about the security of property rights and commercial agreements. Merchants who had conducted business based on one set of political assumptions found themselves needing to recalculate their risks and relationships based on entirely different circumstances. The psychological impact of the revelations on ordinary subjects of the crown was profound and long-lasting. The discovery that their political beliefs and loyalties had been systematically manipulated by foreign agents created a sense of violation that extended far beyond immediate political concerns. Many felt betrayed not just by their leaders, but by their own inability to recognize the deceptions that had been practiced upon them. Shiera Seastar's position following the revelations was particularly tragic. Her relationships with both Daemon and Brynden were now understood to have been manipulated by external forces from the beginning, making it impossible for her to trust her own emotions or the sincerity of her suitors. The revelation that her beauty and influence had been systematically exploited as weapons in a political conspiracy transformed what should have been sources of power and pleasure into burdens that isolated her from authentic human connection. The cultural and artistic impact of the revelations was equally significant. Bards who had unknowingly spread propaganda found their reputations destroyed and their art suspect. Artists who had received patronage from compromised sources discovered that their work was now viewed as politically tainted, regardless of their personal intentions or beliefs. The free exchange of ideas that had characterized the peaceful years of Daemon's reign gave way to suspicion and censorship as everyone became concerned about the potential political implications of creative expression. As news of the revelation spread throughout the realm during the summer of 201 AC, it became clear that the kingdom had reached a point where peaceful resolution of the succession crisis was no longer possible. The exposure of the conspiracy had not restored unity to the royal family or stability to the realm. Instead, it had revealed that the divisions were deeper and more fundamental than anyone had previously understood. The stage was set for open warfare, as various factions prepared to support their chosen claimants through military action rather than legal arguments. The revelation of the truth had paradoxically made the situation more dangerous rather than less so, because it had stripped away the pretenses and accommodations that had allowed different groups to coexist despite their fundamental disagreements. King Daemon found himself ruling a kingdom where a significant portion of the nobility no longer accepted the legitimacy of traditional monarchy, where foreign enemies had successfully weaponized domestic political differences, and where his own family had been torn apart by deceptions so sophisticated that their full implications were still being discovered. The price of revealing the truth had been the destruction of any possibility for the peaceful resolution that had always been his preferred approach to political problems. The realm stood on the brink of a civil war that would be more devastating than anything in its previous history. Not because the issues at stake were more important than those that had driven earlier conflicts, but because the very foundations of political legitimacy had been called into question in ways that made compromise impossible and reconciliation unthinkable. The First Blackfyre Rebellion erupted in 202 AC, exactly as the careful observers had predicted it must, after the revelations about the forged legitimization decree. But standing here now, centuries later, examining the ashes of that great conflict and the 4 others that would follow, we can finally understand what those who lived through these events could not, that the true tragedy was not the wars themselves, but the inexorable logic that made them unavoidable once certain choices had been made. Daemon Blackfyre died on the red grass field in 205 AC, Blackfyre still in his hand, fighting alongside his twin sons Aegon and Aemon, both of whom fell beside their father in that final, desperate charge. Bittersteel escaped with the remaining Blackfyre heirs and founded the Golden Company in exile, carrying the Black Dragon banner across the narrow sea where it would continue to threaten Targaryen rule for generations. The war that should have ended with Daemon's death instead became a curse that would haunt the realm for nearly 6 decades more. King Aegon II survived the First Rebellion, his throne secured by the loyalty of Prince Baelor Breakspear and the ruthless efficiency of Brynden Rivers, now fully transformed into the Master of Whispers whose name would become synonymous with both protection and terror. But the king who emerged from the civil war was changed in fundamental ways, his faith in family bonds shattered, his belief in the possibility of peaceful resolution destroyed by the necessity of winning through violence what he had hoped to preserve through wisdom. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion in 211 would be shorter but no less bitter. The third in 219 would be briefer still, a lightning raid that ended with Daemon Blackfyre's death and Aenys the Pretender's capture. Each successive rebellion would be smaller in scale, but more desperate in character, as the surviving Blackfyre claimants found themselves fighting not just for crowns, but for the survival of their bloodline. The Fourth Rebellion, in 231, brought Daemon III Blackfyre across the narrow sea with renewed hopes and foreign gold, only to meet the same fate that had claimed his predecessors. By then, Aegon IV sat the Iron Throne, and Brynden Rivers had become something beyond human understanding. The last Greasy, watching through ravens and weirwood trees, his 1,000 eyes, and one seeing threats that others could not imagine. The final rebellion, the War of the Ninepenny Kings in 260 AC, would end with Meleys the Monstrous dead on the stepstones, struck down by Ser Barristan Selmy while still young, the last male heir of the Blackfyre line, extinguished forever. The Golden Company would survive, but the cause that had created it would die with its final claimant, leaving only the bitter steel beneath the gold to remember what they had fought for across 6 decades of exile and hope. Yet as we trace the arc of these 5 wars across a century of Westerosi history, a different story emerges beneath the surface narrative of rebellion and loyalty, of legitimate kings defending their thrones against pretenders and usurpers. It becomes a story about the price of secrets, about how deceptions that seem necessary in one generation become curses that poison the next, about the way that foreign manipulation can exploit domestic weaknesses until they become endemic diseases. The foreign conspiracy that had seemed so sophisticated and dangerous in 201 AC revealed itself over time to have been merely the catalyst for conflicts that were already inevitable, given the structural problems within Targaryen rule. The legitimization decree, forged or genuine, had created a situation where multiple individuals with plausible claims to power found themselves competing within a system that could only recognize one legitimate ruler. The foreign gold had accelerated and exacerbated the crisis, but it had not created the underlying conditions that made civil war possible. Each rebellion taught the realm new lessons about the nature of legitimacy and the sources of political authority. Daemon Blackfyre's argument that merit mattered more than birth order found echoes in later political movements throughout Westerosi history. Bittersteel's creation of the Golden Company demonstrated how military professionalism could transcend traditional loyalties and create new forms of political organization. Brynden River's transformation into the Master of Whispers showed how the necessities of security could reshape the fundamental character of royal government. The human cost of these conflicts extended far beyond the famous names who died in battle, or the great houses whose fortunes rose and fell with their chosen sides. Thousands of ordinary soldiers, farmers whose crops were burned, craftsmen whose shops were looted, and merchants whose trade routes were disrupted, paid the price for political decisions made by people they would never meet, and in service of causes they barely understood. But perhaps the greatest cost was paid by the Targaryen dynasty itself, which emerged from the century of Blackfyre rebellions fundamentally weakened in ways that would ultimately make it vulnerable to the final rebellion that would destroy it. Each civil war had required the kings to make compromises and alliances that reduced their independence and autonomy. Each victory had been purchased with concessions that limited future options and created new dependencies. The surveillance state that Brynden Rivers created to protect the realm from internal enemies became a model for royal government that emphasized control over consent, fear over love, and efficiency over justice. The precedents established during the Blackfyre Wars would influence how later Targaryen kings approached threats to their authority, contributing to the paranoia and isolation that would eventually make them unable to respond effectively to legitimate political opposition. The realm that survived the fifth and final Blackfyre rebellion in 260 AC was prosperous and peaceful, but it was also more centralized, more militarized, and more suspicious of dissent than the kingdom that had existed before Aegon the Unworthy's death. The price of victory in the century-long civil war had been the transformation of Westerosi political culture in ways that made it less resilient and less adaptable to future challenges. As we close this long examination of the Blackfyre rebellions, we're left not with simple lessons about loyalty and treason, legitimacy and usurpation, but with more complex questions about the unintended consequences of political choices and the ways that seemingly rational decisions can create irrational outcomes when they interact with forces beyond any individual's control or understanding. The ghosts of these 5 wars would continue to haunt Westeros long after the last pretender fell and the last exile died in foreign lands. The Golden Company would continue to exist, its members remembering oaths sworn to kings who had been dead for decades. The great houses would remember which sides their ancestors had chosen and carry those memories forward into new conflicts. The common people would remember the stories of the Black Dragon and wonder whether their current rulers truly deserved their loyalty. In the end, the Blackfyre rebellions become a meditation on the nature of political authority itself, a century-long exploration of the question that lies at the heart of all government: why should anyone obey anyone else? The answers that emerged from this long conflict were complex, contradictory, and ultimately unsatisfying, which perhaps explains why the questions themselves refused to disappear even after the last battle had been fought and the last pretender had fallen. The realm sleeps now beneath ancient stars, the great castles quiet, the battlefields green again with grass that grows over the bones of the forgotten dead. The ravens watch from their towers, carrying messages that no living ear will hear, while the weirwood trees remember everything and speak to no one. In the deep vaults of history, the truth waits patiently, neither judging nor forgiving, simply preserving the record of human choices and their consequences for whatever future generations might care to learn from the mistakes and triumphs of the past.